TEDx, once more. Why, you may ask? Well, I'll save that until the end of the video if you are curious. A quick note before I start, there is a persistent humming and feedback on the video's audio that I cannot do much about. That's the way I found it. And so, on we go.
It's 2006. I'm teaching in my second year at Valparaiso University, Intro to Creative Writing. And I want to help my students realize that they can bridge their interest in personal expression with social concerns. So I've created an assignment in which we will be researching race and ethnicity on Valparaiso's campus to create a documentary theater project.
Wait, just wait. For your Intro to Creative Writing class, you're assigning students to research race and ethnicity as pertains to the university campus in order to create a documentary theater project. That is not an introduction to creative writing. I was an English major myself. I had to go through more than my fair share of Intro to classes. You've described a Frankenstein's monster of sociology, theater, and, until I hear otherwise, documentary filmmaking. I'm not a minute into this video, and already it seems as though you're abusing your position as an educator. It seems as though you're asserting your own personal agenda, rather than concerning yourself with what is in the best interests of your students.
We've met with Dr. Judy Miller in the archives. She's helped us identify some key historical events we'll need to further research. And as a class, we've come up with a list of groups we feel like will in some way need to be represented in the project. Over the weekend, students are told that they should sign up for one of these groups and identify who they will interview.
Interview? For some reason, I thought it was going to be a research project concerning enrollment statistics. But now you're going to send your students out to act as interviewers. Tell me again where the creative writing enters into this picture.
Monday morning rolls around, and I am preparing for class, and I notice there is one group that no one has signed up for.
Oh, I'll give myself 3 guesses as to which group that was, and 2 don't count. Otherwise, you wouldn't be looking as dour and grim as you are.
It is African Americans.
Of course it was. But a question for you, Professor. Why did you leave it up to the students to choose the group they would interview? You didn't have a sign-up sheet with a cap number of slots for each group? Were the students able to know how many of them had decided to pick which groups? I am forced to suspect that maybe, just maybe, you set up a blind sign-up process on your students as a social experiment all your own.
And this feels meaningful to me. We are a class of predominantly white students, and I am a white faculty member.
Thus, we are inherently guilty for the crime of our own skin color. And as the professor who checks her privilege, you maintain the catbird seat on being able to judge your evil, racist students.
So when I go into class, I ask people why didn't anyone sign up for the African American community? And students began with, well, I don't know anybody who's African American, or I don't have any black friends. But we quickly realized that not everyone was interviewing someone they knew.
I'm still waiting for the creative writing aspect here. Also, you seem grimly smug, if that's a description that makes sense at all.
As we talked about this further, we realized that there was a lot of fear. How can I, as a white person, go up to somebody black and ask them to talk to me about race? It felt presumptuous, and we were afraid of being judged.
Well, isn't that the lesson of social justice? That to question the lived experience of marginalized groups is merely a reflection of one's privilege, of not having to know the oppressions and struggles people of color have to deal with every single day? It honestly scares me how easily all of that rolled out of me as I typed up this part of my script. Did my parody sound all that much unlike what is said by the true believers?
It also occurred to me that for some of my students, this might have been the first time that they really had to identify as white, and it was in a way that made them feel uncomfortable.
No, not at all. Forcing your students to have to think of themselves and other people as being assessed on the basis of something they have no control over and is one of the most contentious and irrelevant subjects you could hope to interview someone about? You're holding the Damocles sword of required credit hours over the heads of your students in order to force them into intentional discomfort so you can instill the guilt of original sin into them. You are a frightening person.
So as a faculty member who doesn't like to ask her students to take risks she herself won't take, I said, okay, well, I will sign up.
So very brave of you. And again, why didn't you use a sign-up sheet? Why didn't you just group up your students and pair them off into the different groups to interview? Granted, this story is even true, this problem you encountered could have easily been avoided, which tells me that you wanted it to happen.
And I approached the president of the Black Student Organization and asked if I could attend a general meeting and do a group interview. I was thinking a variety of voices would be interesting instead of one representative voice.
A variety of voices, delineated by skin color.
So he said he would ask, and he found out, and he got back to me, and I was invited to one of their general meetings, and we had an hour and a half of very rich conversation. This was not the first time that interviewing as a practice had taken me outside my comfort zone. But it was the first time that I began to realize interviewing as a practice could help me expand my comfort zone.
I, me, my. Wasn't this story about your students? Or is this the story of how you came to find Jesus?
Not that any particular relationship on that night extended beyond the length of the meeting.
So you just hit it and quit it? Okay.
But in sharing their stories with me and in trusting their experiences to me, the students shaped me and prepared me for future relationships that I might have otherwise missed.
So up to that point, you had avoided Black students as well? Maybe this is the story of how you were born again.
Jumping ahead 10 years, it's 2016, and I'm co-directing the project, the Welcome Project, with Liz Werfel, Associate Professor of Art here at Valpo. This is an ongoing digital story collection. It started here on campus with questions around belonging and not belonging. But recently we've expanded to make it a Northwest Indiana cross-county story collection. And in these last 7 years, I have participated in over 100 interviews, and I've heard so many stories.
These kind of projects can be pretty cool, actually. I remember years ago, and maybe this is still an ongoing thing, where NPR was involved with a story project, interviewing random people about their lives and archiving them for posterity. There are a lot of interesting stories out there, a lot of living history that might otherwise be lost without such projects. But what bothers me about this professor in particular is the implication of her motivation. Because while this is called the Welcome Project, her presentation so far makes it sound more like the White Guilt Project.
And all of these stories have changed me. And I don't just mean my values and beliefs, though these two have also been expanded or challenged or confirmed. But I mean something more fundamentally me. I'm more curious than I've ever been. I want to know about experiences that I won't or can't have. I have courage now to go to places where I know I'm going to feel uncomfortable.
Not sure if that is courage rather than internalized masochism. Is this white privilege exposure therapy? Are you trying to cure yourself? Cleanse your sins? Because that's what it sounds like.
So how does this happen? I've been talking to you about interviewing as a practice. And in the Welcome Project, it is our method of story collection. But it's not the power that transforms. That's listening.
Interviewing as a practice. Power. Transformation. This really does sound like a quasi-religious endeavor for this professor.
So when I think of interviewing, I think of a professional situation. I think of an expert who's entering in to gather facts and information, who will attempt to remain objective. The posture for me is somebody leaning forward, microphone in hand, maybe even poking or prodding.
Objectivity? Well, that would be for a journalism class. But you teach creative writing, or don't you? So wait, are you contrasting what you do with someone who is being objective? That would be an interesting, if subtle, admission.
Listening, on the other hand, to me feels very receptive. Open, arms back, chest exposed. There's a sense of vulnerability that comes with listening.
Listening alone isn't interviewing. You're a creative writing teacher. Break down the word interview into its component parts. What you're describing sounds more like listen and believe than it does interview.
It is that vulnerability that has made the interview and the listening process work. So I'm vulnerable in the sense that I expose my ignorance in the way in which I listen to someone's story from their center of authority on their own terms, even if at times those terms bring up my own biases or assumptions or judgments. The vulnerability that comes with catching myself having those assumptions and needing to turn them into questions. The vulnerability that comes with allowing that this person's story, this person before me, will change me in ways that I can't control.
So you're approaching someone with the deferential presumption of there being an authority figure. You take anything they say that you find conflicting with your own views as evidence that you are somehow flawed in your thinking. And this in turn becomes questions you ask of these presumed authority figures that are intended to help you think in a more correct and humble way. Do I have that right?
So an example.
Please, by all means, because the way I understood you sounded utterly insane. I honestly hope I am proven wrong.
My first Welcome Project interview was with a student from the south side of Chicago, African American, female, and she was telling me about growing up in her neighborhood and what a typical day like was with her family. And as I listened to her talk, I realized that in some ways her story confirmed what I had been told about living in the south side of Chicago by media and other sources. But in other ways, her story interrupted that representation, that description. It challenged it. It said things that that representation had never even presented at all.
Well, of course you will get unique anecdotal information by talking to an individual as compared to generalized media reports on overall events and trends. How can this be any kind of revelation for you?
And as I realized that, I also realized I had this assumption that no one would ever want to grow up in a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. No one would ever want to grow up in a housing project. And so catching myself in that assumption, I was able then to present it to the storyteller as a question. And she could tell me further about what from her neighborhood she was proud of, what formative experiences she had with her family, with her neighbors, with her church. Formative experiences that she wouldn't trade for anything in the world, even the difficult, challenging circumstances which she did hope to change about her neighborhood.
Your interview subject sounds like a commendable person. Under trying circumstances, she made the best of her situation, learning and evolving despite the lot fate had put her in. Good for her. Certainly your subject couldn't, and apparently wouldn't, exchange her growing up for anything. But I wonder if that same circumstance is something she would want her children to have to experience. Did you happen to ask her that question? Or did your guilt prevent you?
And this happened to me time and time and time again. In interviews, the individuals telling me about their circumstances disrupted the biases or assumptions I had about what those circumstances must be like as they presented to me what it was like to live on the ground.
This really is a confession session. Yes, there is a world outside of your personal bubble. Congratulations. But I am beginning to wonder how much of this interviewing is fueled by genuine curiosity, and how much of it comes from a strange addiction for self-pity.
And in time, I began to trust this listening process, that this whole cycle would happen. And that gave me the courage to go to places I wouldn't normally have gone, because I knew there were stories waiting. One of those places is Gary, Indiana.
Okay, this next bit is a somewhat long soliloquy about Gary, Indiana. I'm going to let it play out in full because A, full context of what she says is important, and B, she has such a set of run-on sentences here that there's really no clean point to make an edit.
It used to be a place that I would drive by on my way to Chicago. And now, because of the flight paths cross-county collection that the Welcome Project is doing, it is a city of neighborhoods. West Side, East Side, Midtown, Etna, Miller, Glen Park, Tulliston, and so many more. It used to be a city with a reputation, and now it's the city of the Calumet Regional Archives and Indiana University Northwest, and Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson and City Hall. A place of abandoned lots and boarded up houses, yes, but also of storefront churches and Black Lives Matter Northwest Indiana Gary.
City landmark, city landmark, city landmark, racist social justice movement, city landmark, city landmark. One of these things is not like the others.
And Miller Beach Arts and Creative District, and St. John's Lutheran Church and Temple Israel and the National Lakeshore. And it isn't that I don't go into Gary without trepidation now, especially if at times I know I will be the only person who's white.
Because the people of Gary, Indiana, hate white people? Huh?
This has been a process for me. It has required baby steps, each interview its own baby step. And there are still places that I am finding the courage to go. But now for me, those places are the rural neighborhoods of Northwest Indiana, the farms and grain elevators, the homes that have a Trump sign in the yard or a Confederate flag flying, or whose owners might be card-carrying members of the NRA.
Those horrible, horrible people who possess a different political opinion than you do. Such danger you face. Such courage you possess. And are most of these people white? Oh, so brave. So brave.
Northwest Indiana, like every region, has a history, complicated history. The Klan has had roots in Porter County.
The Klan? Does this count as a variant of Godwin's Law? The Klan was all but extinguished in Indiana back in the 1930s.
Gary in Lake County is the first city of its size to have had a black mayor.
I looked that up, and she's absolutely correct. An interesting historical fact, though Richard Gordon Hatcher was indeed the first elected black mayor in the U.S., he was not the first black man to enter into the office of mayor in the U.S. Just a few days after Hatcher's election in Indiana, Carl Stokes became the first elected black mayor of Cleveland, Ohio. Stokes ended up being inaugurated into office shortly before Hatcher was. So technically, Stokes was the first black person to take office as a mayor of a major city, one much larger than Gary, Indiana, but Hatcher was indeed the first black person elected as mayor in the U.S. Kind of interesting. Just thought I would share.
And white flight started in part as a reaction to that election and continued as people were drawn out to the suburbs and the mill started to lay people off.
Yes, and the racists from some 4 decades in the past should feel ashamed of themselves if it was a black mayor that caused them to leave. And you bring this up, why? Why are you seemingly carrying the sins of a time before you were born and had nothing to do with into the present and assuming a creepy responsibility for them?
And our stories in the region of who stayed and who left, why we stayed, why we left, and what happened to our neighborhoods in light of that are very close to us. They're very personal stories. And they're sometimes very raw. And at the Welcome Project, we want to bring those stories back out into the public, into a common space where we can talk about what they mean for us today and how they might instruct us to be good neighbors.
People require instruction on how to be a good neighbor. You know, I hear there are several very, very old books that also claim to have the proper instructions for such a goal. But that aside, I don't think that's it. As educational and as valuable a time capsule as many of these stories might be, I don't think preservation of the past is your prime motivation for taking part in the project. Because everything you have said to this point leads me to suspect that what you want out of looking for these stories of social, class, and racial strife is to dwell, to create a body of work you can try to point at as proof of your efforts to divest yourself of your original sin, the sin of being white. And at the same time feed this weird self-pity addiction of yours, the same one you tried to instill into your students all those years ago.
And if we can dare to listen in this way, if we can dare to listen together, then we might not be able to see all the changes we want to see in our cities, our neighborhoods, and our communities, but we will start to see the change we want to see in ourselves, and that will lay the foundation for the work at hand. Thank you.
To reiterate, the idea of chronicling the stories of ordinary people, especially from times before it was so easy to record our everyday lives, is an important, and in some ways even priceless, endeavor. What bothered me about this talk, as with so many of these TED Talks, is that this is an educator. This is someone who used a basic creative writing course to put her students through a lesson of self-hatred, and as well to view those who don't share their skin color as victims who are owed deference for sins her students never committed. It is well-meaning undertakings like these, used as Trojan horses for self-diminishing ideologies, that bother me the most. The wolves in sheep's clothing. Now, at the beginning of this video, I promised an answer as to why I end up doing these TEDx talks so often. I mean, I've done commentaries on a raft of other more eclectic pieces, and yet I keep exposing myself to places like TEDx and Stanford University. Why is that? The fact of the matter is that I like TED Talks, and even some TEDx talks. Many of them are interesting. Some of them are very good. And so it's when I come across a lecture that grates on my senses that I feel the urge to say something. Since starting my channel, I have tried to figure out what my style is, or at least my focus. As far as subject matter to analyze, I tend to stay within the social justice and regressive realm. As far as the speakers themselves, I find myself more often than not focusing on those who present themselves as authority figures, the experts, and the educators. Because those professing to know the big answers should be and need to be challenged with big questions. It is this endless conversation that we all need to participate in, because as long as we are talking, we are not truly fighting. As always, thank you for watching.